Imagine losing the love of your life, and deciding to honor her with something beautiful, a hand-built stone bridge crossing the creek behind your home. But just when grief turns to purpose, an unexpected enemy rises, your own homeowners association. One neighbor, driven by control and hidden secrets, does everything to stop you: fake violations, midnight sabotage, and a $50,000 lawsuit. Yet buried in old surveys and quiet determination lies a truth powerful enough to turn the tables and expose the real trespasser. This is the story of Helen's Crossing, how love, patience, and one man's promise overcame pettiness, fear, and lies. Stay with me, because what happens next will prove that sometimes the strongest bridges aren't built from stone alone. I'm Art Holloway, a 37-year-old structural engineer, and until 3 months ago, I thought I understood what it meant to lose something. Then came that rainy Tuesday morning in late February, a day that started like any other, with the sound of Helen humming softly in the kitchen as she packed her lunch for work. She was only 34, and yet she carried herself with the quiet wisdom of someone who understood what truly mattered: laughter, love, and small moments shared. The phone call came just past 9 a.m. A police officer's voice, calm and practiced, told me there'd been an accident on Highway 17. The words barely registered: single vehicle, wet conditions, declared deceased at the scene. My chest felt like it had caved in. I remember dropping the phone, the dull thud as it hit the carpet, and the next thing I knew, I was sitting on the floor staring at the coffee table, the morning sun slicing across the room in cruel, indifferent lines. In the days that followed, our house turned into a hollow shell. Helen's favorite ceramic mug still sat by the sink, its handle chipped from the time I clumsily knocked it over. She'd laughed it off, calling it character. Her book lay open on the living room chair, spine bent where she'd left it. The scent of her vanilla shampoo lingered on her pillow, an echo of presence that twisted the knife deeper every night. But what hurt most wasn't just her absence. It was the sudden vacuum of all the plans we'd made. Helen had a gift for dreaming, not grand, flashy ambitions, but small, deeply human hopes that stitched our days together. And one of her simplest, most persistent dreams was about that creek running through the back of our yard. On quiet evenings, we'd sit on the porch with steaming mugs of chamomile tea. Helen would gaze across the gentle water and describe the bridge she envisioned. Nothing elaborate, just a modest hand-built stone span, about 12 feet long and 4 feet wide. Wide enough for us to walk side by side. She'd talk about planting climbing roses at either end so that in summer, the blooms would spill across the stones in soft reds and pinks. On the far bank, beneath the old oak tree, she dreamed of placing a weathered bench. "Just imagine us sitting there on Sunday mornings, Art," she'd say, her fingers brushing mine. "Rain or shine, we'd cross together." At the time, I nodded along, half listening, half distracted by deadlines and work emails. Now, I'd give anything to hear her describe that bridge again. After the funeral, the silence in our house was suffocating. The hum of the fridge, the creak of the floorboards, even the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, all reminders of a life paused mid-sentence. I couldn't bring myself to box up Helen's clothes or clear her side of the closet. Every item felt sacred, infused with memory. Then one bleak Saturday morning, I stood at the bedroom window and found my gaze locked on the creek. The winter rain had swollen it a little, and its gentle current seemed almost alive. And I heard Helen's voice in my mind, soft but clear: we'd cross together. That's when it clicked. The bridge wasn't just about stone and mortar. It was Helen's way of saying we should stay connected, to each other, to our land, and to the life we'd built. In that moment, the idea became more than her dream, it became my purpose. A promise to her that even if death had torn us apart, I wouldn't let it erase what we shared. So, I decided to build it. Not someday, not when I had more time, but now. Every stone would carry her memory. Every hour spent planning, digging, and shaping would be a conversation with her spirit. It wouldn't heal the hole in my chest, but maybe it could become a bridge back to hope. That winter morning, standing by the window, I made a vow: I would build Helen's bridge. And in doing so, I'd keep a part of her alive, forever crossing between what we had and what remains. Helen never dreamed in marble or gold. Her dreams were woven from simpler things: weathered stone, climbing roses, and quiet mornings by the creek. That bridge she pictured wasn't meant to impress guests or appear in glossy magazines. It was a bridge built for two, wide enough that we could walk across it, shoulder to shoulder, without brushing against the low stone walls. 12 feet long, 4 feet wide, just enough to span the gentle curve of the water that traced the back of our property. Some evenings, after dinner, we'd step out onto the porch, mugs of tea warming our hands. The sun would hang low, filtering through the cottonwood leaves, painting the creek in strokes of amber and gold. Helen would lean on the railing, eyes soft, and begin describing the bridge. She always spoke as if it already existed, her words drawing it in the air between us. "It should look like it's always been here," she'd say, her gaze following the water's path. "Rough fieldstone, nothing shiny or new. And it should sit low, almost hugging the creek, so the ducks can glide under it without feeling crowded." She had an artist's instinct for blending beauty with nature. The fieldstone wouldn't be cut to perfection but kept a little rugged, allowing moss to creep into the cracks over time. In Helen's mind, the imperfections weren't flaws, they were what made the bridge feel alive, as though it had stood through seasons of rain and sun, silently watching over our little corner of the world. And always, at the far end of her imagined bridge, stood the oak tree. Its massive trunk and sprawling branches had weathered decades, maybe even a century. Underneath its shade, Helen wanted a simple wooden bench, cedar she thought, because it resisted rot. She pictured us sitting there together, the morning mist curling around us, cups of steaming coffee in hand. "You'd bring the newspaper," she'd tease, "and I'd bring nothing at all, just me and the roses." The roses, in Helen's vision, played their own part. She wanted them climbing trellises on either side of the bridge, trained so their blooms would spill over the stone during late spring and summer. Red and pink mostly, with a few creamy whites to soften the palate. "Imagine the smell in June," she'd murmur, eyes half closed, as though she could already breathe in the sweet, drifting perfume. It wasn't a grand design by most standards, but it felt deeply grand to us. Because it wasn't just a bridge to cross a creek, it was a promise of shared moments yet to come. A place to pause together, away from the weight of daily life. A quiet retreat where laughter and conversation could flow as easily as the water beneath our feet. After Helen died, the house felt like it had lost its heartbeat. But when I thought about her bridge, I could almost hear her voice again, soft, certain, full of quiet hope. The vision she described so many times became more than a blueprint, it became a thread tying me to her. When grief threatened to drown me, the memory of her standing on the porch, tracing the shape of that bridge in the air, pulled me back to the surface. It was never about building something impressive. Helen wanted a place where memories could live alongside the present. A place where, even if the years changed everything else, we'd still have a spot that felt timeless, stone, roses, and morning light dancing on the creek's rippling surface. In the months after losing her, I clung to that vision like a raft. Every detail she'd imagined became precious. The fieldstone had to be local, the bench under the oak had to face east to catch the sunrise, and the roses had to be climbing varieties tough enough to weather our winters. It wasn't enough to build something that looked like her dream, it had to feel like her dream too. Helen's bridge, in the end, wasn't about crossing from one side of the creek to the other. It was about crossing from memory into presence, from what we had to what could still be. And in that quiet, stubborn hope, I found the strength to keep going. Grief has a strange way of reshaping even the parts of you that once felt unshakable. As an engineer, I'd always believed in precision, logic, and careful preparation. But after Helen died, those same habits became something more than professional instinct. They became my refuge, a way to keep her memory alive through action. I threw myself into the bridge project with a kind of focused determination I hadn't felt in months. It wasn't just about building, it was about building right. I started by gathering every document I could find about the land, old surveys, soil maps, floodplain data. Even late at night, when sleep wouldn't come, I'd be at my kitchen table under the dull light of a single lamp, drafting sketches on graph paper. Helen's voice lingered in my head, guiding each choice. Fieldstone walls low enough to see the creek, a wooden bench angled to catch the morning sun. The first step was securing approval from the county. I filed structural plans showing how the bridge would distribute weight, ensuring it could hold 2 people, or me pushing our old riding mower across for yard work. I commissioned a soil analysis to confirm the creek banks could support the foundation without erosion. It wasn't just red tape to me. It was my promise to Helen that her bridge would endure long after I was gone. Within 6 weeks, the county signed off. Their letter of approval felt almost sacred when I held it. Late that evening, I stood by the creek and whispered to the breeze, "We're really doing this, Helen." The empty yard offered no answer, but the hush of water over stones felt like quiet encouragement. Next came sourcing the materials. I didn't want anything mass-produced or imported. I contacted local quarries, walking among massive piles of fieldstone to choose each rock myself. They were imperfect, pitted, speckled, lichen-kissed, but to me they felt alive, like pieces of our landscape that had been waiting decades to serve a purpose. Helen would have loved them for their character. By early spring, I scheduled the first deliveries. The ground would be firm enough from winter frost to handle heavy pallets without churning the earth into mud. The logistics were almost soothing, calculating stone weights, foundation depths, drainage, and runoff paths. Each decision was deliberate, rooted in both practicality and love. Then came clearing the site. The creek banks were tangled with scrub, wild grass, and the occasional stubborn sapling. At first, the work felt purely physical, sweat and muscle meeting resistance. But with every swing of the loppers, every shovel of earth turned, I felt grief loosen its grip just a little. It was as if each thorny vine removed was another inch closer to something Helen had dreamed of. I kept her vision taped above my workbench, a pencil sketch she'd once doodled on the back of an old grocery list. It wasn't to scale and looked almost childlike, but it captured the soul of what she wanted, a simple bridge crowned with roses, blending so naturally with the creek that visitors might think it had always been there. Some evenings, after finishing for the day, I'd stand knee-deep in the mud, looking at the cleared banks and trying to see what Helen had seen. It wasn't always easy. Grief can cloud your eyes as surely as fog rolling across the water. But then I'd remember her words, rain or shine, we'll cross it together. And I'd breathe deeply, steady my resolve, and keep going. Every part of the plan mattered to me, not just because I'm an engineer, but because it felt like the last conversation Helen and I were still having. Each measurement, each choice of stone and timber, was an act of devotion. In building the bridge, I wasn't just shaping rock and wood. I was shaping memory into something solid and lasting, a promise set in stone, connecting the life we'd shared to the life I still had to live. And in that process, my grief found something it desperately needed: purpose. For weeks, the bridge project felt like it belonged only to Helen and me, a private conversation carried on in quiet dawn hours and late evenings by the creek. But grief, as I'd learned, rarely moves in a straight line. And neither, it turned out, did neighborhood politics. It was a crisp Thursday morning when trouble first appeared, not as thunder or rain, but as the sharp click of heels on damp grass and a clipped voice that cut through my focus like a cold wind. "Excuse me," the voice said, dripping with that peculiar brand of politeness that's really anything but. I straightened up from the creek bank, spray can still in hand, and turned. There, standing on the slope just above me, was Carol Peterson. Mid-40s, perfectly highlighted hair, blazer so crisp it could have been ironed 5 minutes ago. In her hand was a leather portfolio, hugged tightly to her chest like a shield, or a weapon. I knew of Carol only by reputation. In every HOA, there's someone who seems to breathe bylaws the way the rest of us breathe air. Carol was that person. Rumor had it she'd once demanded a neighbor repaint a garden shed because the color wasn't harmonious with community aesthetic. Seeing her standing there, expression set and posture rigid, my stomach tightened before she even spoke. "What exactly," she began, voice measured but edged, "are you planning to build here?" I opened my mouth, then paused, wiping mud from my gloves onto my jeans. "A small pedestrian bridge," I said finally, forcing calm into my voice. "To cross the creek." My words felt clumsy against her polished suspicion. Carol's eyes narrowed slightly. "And do you have approval for this?" she asked, chin lifting a fraction as if to emphasize the question's weight. I nodded, reaching for my folder resting on a nearby stone. "Yes. County-approved permits, environmental clearance, structural drawings," I said, flipping it open. Papers rustled in the breeze, edges stained with mud from my work. She barely glanced at them. Her eyes, sharp and pale, flicked over the documents without focus, like someone scanning a menu for something to object to, rather than something to choose. Her lips pressed into a thin, skeptical line. "I'm sorry for your loss," she added abruptly, the words mechanical, devoid of warmth. It stung, not the words themselves, but the way they felt obligatory, like punctuation rather than empathy. "Thank you," I said quietly. Helen would have wanted me to stay calm. Carol shifted her weight, her polished flats sinking slightly into the damp earth. "You are aware," she continued, "that the HOA has strict covenants regarding any construction near water features?" "I've read the covenants thoroughly," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "They don't mention a setback for small pedestrian structures. And the county's reviewed and approved everything." Her gaze hardened, as if my preparedness irritated rather than reassured her. "We'll just have to see about that," she said, her voice dipping into something almost smug. Then she did something that made the morning air feel suddenly colder. She pulled out her phone, stepped closer to the creek, and began snapping photos, foundation markers, spray-painted lines, even my tools. Each click of the shutter felt invasive, like someone rifling through a private diary. She scribbled notes onto a small pad, her brows drawn in a tight line of concentration. I wanted to ask what she was writing, but something told me it wouldn't matter. A crow cawed from the oak above, the only witness to the strange tableau. Me, a man building a memorial to his wife, and Carol, already preparing her opening arguments. Finally, she tucked the phone into her blazer pocket, flipped her pad closed, and offered a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Enjoy your day, Mr. Holloway," she said, before turning and making her way back up the slope, her shoes leaving precise, narrow prints in the dewy grass. I stood there for a long moment after she left, the creek bubbling at my feet, foundation lines still bright and hopeful against the soil. But the encounter had left a chill in the air, a feeling that the bridge Helen and I had dreamed of wouldn't come into the world without resistance. The first storm cloud had appeared, not in the sky, but in the shape of a neighbor who saw my promise of love not as something to honor, but as something to challenge. When Carol left that morning, her footsteps echoing in the damp grass, I stood staring at the creek a long while. The spray-painted markers that once felt like symbols of hope now seemed like bright warnings, exposed and vulnerable. But after a few deep breaths, I reminded myself why I was doing this. For Helen. For the quiet promise we'd made to each other on countless evenings. And so, I steadied my resolve. Later that afternoon, I gathered my documents into a neat binder: engineering plans, county approvals, environmental impact clearances, and annotated notes from the HOA covenants I'd read cover to cover. Helen had always teased me about my habit of over-preparing for meetings, even casual ones, but today, it felt necessary. I wasn't just defending a project, I was defending her memory. The next day, I saw Carol again as she walked briskly down the sidewalk toward the creek. Sunlight caught on the clip in her hair, and her posture suggested she was ready for confrontation. Her eyes flicked to my binder immediately. "Good morning, Carol," I said, making my voice as even and calm as possible. "Mr. Holloway," she replied, her tone as crisp as the morning air. "I've come to follow up regarding the structure you're planning." I nodded, opening my binder. "I completely understand. I wanted to show you everything I've prepared. The county has signed off," I explained, turning to the stamped approval page. "The bridge is pedestrian only, built to preserve the creek's flow and avoid harming vegetation. It also meets all load requirements." Carol leaned closer, scanning the page. For a brief second, her professional mask slipped, replaced by something almost like curiosity, but it quickly returned. "And you're sure you reviewed the HOA covenants thoroughly?" she asked, her voice tightening. "Yes," I replied, gently but firmly. "I read all 47 pages. The covenants don't mention a specific setback from natural water features, and there's no section prohibiting pedestrian bridges of this size. The only setback guidelines are for permanent dwelling structures or fences over 6 feet tall." Carol's expression barely changed, but something flickered in her eyes, annoyance, maybe, or frustration that I wasn't the unprepared homeowner she'd expected. She thumbed through the binder perfunctorily, as if just going through the motions. "I see," she said curtly. "Well, the committee will need to review this more closely." "Of course," I said, trying to keep my voice measured, though my heart was pounding. "If you'd like, I can also share digital copies with the committee. And I'm happy to answer any technical questions." She didn't respond right away, instead glancing around the creek, as if looking for something to critique. Her gaze lingered on the rough clearing I'd made and the stone piles stacked neatly nearby. It struck me then, she wasn't seeing Helen's vision, a small, quiet tribute. She saw a disruption, something that challenged her sense of control over the neighborhood. After a beat, she turned back to me, lips pinched. "We'll just have to see about that," she repeated, her tone carrying an unmistakable note of condescension. In that moment, it was clear, this wasn't about rules, safety, or aesthetics. It was about authority. Carol needed to remind me, and maybe herself, that the HOA, her committee, stood above individual grief, even when that grief built something as gentle as a memorial bridge. She pivoted slightly, phone already in hand, snapping another series of photos, the creek, the markers, even me standing there, binder still open. Each click felt invasive, as though she was documenting evidence of a crime I hadn't committed. "Thank you for your cooperation, Mr. Holloway," she said finally, tucking her phone away and offering a tight, formal smile. "We'll be in touch." With that, she walked away, her clipboard under her arm, her back straight as a measuring stick. I watched her until she disappeared beyond the bend in the path. For a moment, the familiar ache of grief mingled with something new, frustration. Helen's dream had never been meant to spark conflict. But I reminded myself of something Helen used to say whenever life became difficult: kindness first, Art. But don't mistake kindness for surrender. That afternoon, as the sun filtered through the creek's rippling water, I closed the binder gently. My defense had been polite, measured, and rooted in truth. But if Carol pushed further, I knew I'd be ready, not just as an engineer, but as a husband defending a promise. That evening, I tried to settle back into my usual routine. I made a simple dinner, ate at the kitchen table where Helen and I used to share slow conversations about nothing and everything, and stared out at the darkening creek. The bridge site, lit faintly by the porch light, looked calm, almost peaceful. For a moment, it felt like maybe, just maybe, things would stay that way. But at exactly 6:30 p.m., my phone buzzed. The sender's name glowed on the screen: Carol Peterson. I opened the email, my pulse quickening. Its subject line alone made my chest tighten: urgent, Creekside construction violation. Notice the body of the email was a wall of formal, bureaucratic language. Carol had clearly spent time crafting each sentence, making it sound official enough to intimidate. According to her, my bridge project violated Section 12B of the HOA covenants, which allegedly prohibited any structure within 50 feet of a natural water source without explicit HOA approval. For a moment, doubt crept in. My eyes scanned the words again and again, the legal-sounding phrases swirling together. Had I somehow missed something? My engineering training had taught me to respect rules and double-check assumptions. But grief does strange things. It makes you question what you know, even when you know it deeply. So, binder still open on my lap, I pulled the HOA covenants from my desk drawer, the same dog-eared 47-page document I had read late into the night weeks earlier. Page by page, I flipped through, skimming every section title: setbacks, fencing, exterior paint colors, even rules about holiday decorations and seasonal wreaths. Sections 1 through 11, clear, straightforward, and familiar. But there was no Section 12B. In fact, there wasn't even a Section 12. I read it again, slower this time. Still nothing. It was as though Carol had conjured a phantom rule out of thin air. A ghost regulation, meant to look intimidating enough that I might panic, back down, or worst of all, halt construction indefinitely. I leaned back in my chair, the house silent except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking of the clock on the wall. Anger began to replace the initial confusion, slow, simmering anger. Not the hot, reckless kind, but the focused, deliberate kind that builds resolve. Carol's move wasn't an accident or misunderstanding. It was calculated. The formal language, the timing of the email right at dinner, the use of urgent, all classic intimidation tactics designed to overwhelm and isolate. And the fact that it came just one day after she'd visited the site and found no clear violation told me everything. She hadn't found a rule, so she invented one. As an engineer, I couldn't ignore facts. And the facts were clear: my project had county approval. It complied fully with the actual covenants, which I could quote line by line if needed. Carol's claim had no basis in reality. But what struck me most wasn't the dishonesty itself, it was the confidence it took to try. She was gambling on the idea that a grieving husband wouldn't have the strength or focus to push back. I closed the binder slowly, my fingers brushing across the pages Helen had inspired. That small touch reminded me why I had started this. Helen's dream had never been about defiance, but it had always been about love, and love, real love, doesn't yield to fear. I decided not to respond right away. Instead, I made notes of the timing, the exact wording, and saved the email in multiple folders. If Carol's challenge was a test to see how easily I'd back down, she was about to learn that while grief had broken my heart, it hadn't taken away my resolve. I also knew something else. Bullies often push hardest when they sense someone is vulnerable. But engineers, by nature, don't rely on assumptions. We rely on evidence. And Carol's fake regulation had no evidence to stand on. That night, I sat at the window again, looking at the moonlit creek where Helen's bridge would soon rise. My grief was still there, a dull ache in every breath, But alongside it, a quiet determination had taken root. Carol's email had planted a seed, yes, but not of fear. It planted a commitment to see Helen's dream through, no matter how many obstacles she decided to invent. After reading Carol's email half a dozen times, I set it down on the table beside Helen's chipped ceramic mug. The words still seemed to echo in my head, Section 12B official sounding. Confident. Calculated. I knew it didn't exist. But I also knew that just knowing wouldn't be enough, not against someone like Carol, who wielded rules and authority like weapons. Helen had always believed in the power of kindness paired with quiet strength, and I could almost hear her voice urging me, don't just react, be sure. So that night, I opened the HOA covenants again. The same dog-eared, coffee-stained document I'd read before the project began, its legal phrasing and neatly numbered sections more familiar to me than some of my old engineering textbooks. Sitting at the kitchen table, I flipped through every page, highlighter in hand, scanning line by line. Sections 1 through 11, setbacks for permanent dwellings, restrictions on exterior finishes, height limits for fences and sheds, holiday decoration timeframes. But still, nothing beyond Section 11. No mention, anywhere, of water features, creeks, or setbacks specific to pedestrian bridges. And absolutely no Section 12B. I checked the table of contents again. Even tried searching the digital copy I'd saved on my laptop. The same result, the covenants ended cleanly at Section 11, the last rule covering things like seasonal holiday lights and guidelines for mailbox design. The so-called Section 12B was as fictional as the Easter Bunny, except far less charming. But Carol had sent that email with absolute certainty, almost as if she expected me not to question it. Maybe most people wouldn't have. Maybe they'd have panicked, halted construction, or even offered an apology. But engineers don't accept anything without data, and grief, painful as it was, hadn't taken that from me. In that quiet moment, the pattern became clearer. Carol's visit, the photos she snapped without real curiosity, the abrupt politeness dripping with authority. The fake regulation wasn't an accident. It was the opening move in what felt like a planned strategy. See if the widower, still raw with loss, would fold when challenged. I realized that Carol probably assumed no one would bother verifying the covenant text. After all, who reads HOA documents for fun? But I had. More than once. And the more I thought about it, the more her tactics made sense, like a trial balloon. If I reacted by stopping work, she'd know intimidation worked. If I challenged her, she'd escalate. But either way, she'd force me to spend time, money, and emotional energy defending something that was, by every written rule, already permitted. But I also knew one thing from years as an engineer: always gather proof before you confront. Carol's strategy relied on secrecy and unverified claims. My strategy would rely on evidence. So after confirming for myself that no such section existed, I printed out the entire HOA document, every single page, stapled neatly, with highlights marking each section header. I labeled a copy of Carol's email, noting the date and time. Then, I wrote a short summary outlining the discrepancy, carefully sticking to facts rather than emotion. As I worked, my anger slowly shifted into something colder, sharper: resolve. Helen's bridge wasn't just about stone and mortar anymore. It was about truth against manipulation, love against control. The kitchen clock ticked past midnight, the house wrapped in a silence so deep it almost hummed. Outside, the creek glinted under the moon, calm and patient. It had been there long before Carol's rules and would remain long after. I closed the binder with the printed covenants inside and ran my hand across the cover. Tomorrow, I wouldn't confront Carol, not yet. Instead, I'd observe, collect, and stay calm. Helen had always believed that the right answer revealed itself if you didn't rush. In that moment, I realized something powerful. Carol might control committees and rules on paper, but what she couldn't control was truth, and the quiet determination of someone building not for ego or money, but for love. The next move was hers, but unlike her, I had facts on my side. And even through grief's haze, that gave me strength I hadn't known I still had. By the next morning, my resolve had crystallized into a plan. Carol's fake violation notice wasn't just an annoyance, it was a sign she might escalate. And while my engineering background had taught me to trust data, life had taught me to trust my gut, and my gut said Carol wasn't finished. As I sipped coffee at the kitchen table, staring out at the creek where Helen's bridge would rise, I thought of something Helen used to say whenever she sensed trouble before it fully arrived: prepare quietly but thoroughly. She believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but also in being ready if kindness wasn't enough. So that morning, I drove to a local hardware store, the bell above the door jingling a sharp welcome that cut through the fog of my grief. I knew exactly what I needed: a high-definition security camera with night vision, motion detection, and enough storage to capture several days of footage. Something discreet, reliable, nothing flashy, just functional. The young man behind the counter tried to upsell me on a system that would sync to my phone and send instant alerts. I politely declined. This wasn't about panic-driven responses. It was about gathering proof, quietly and carefully, so if Carol turned rumors into action, the truth would speak louder than words. Back at home, I unpacked the camera on my workbench. The familiar click of tools, the smell of new electronics mixed with the earthy scent drifting through the open window, it felt strangely grounding. For a moment, it reminded me of weekend afternoons when Helen would sit on the back step, reading a book aloud as I fixed the gate or tuned the mower. By early afternoon, I walked the property, camera in hand, looking for the perfect vantage point. The creek ran like a silver ribbon through the yard, its banks lined with thick evergreen bushes, a natural hiding spot. I crouched in the shade, the air cool against my face, and positioned the camera about 20 feet from the construction markers. Hidden in green needles, angled perfectly to capture anyone stepping onto the worksite. I tested it, waving my hand in front of the lens. A quiet blink of the indicator light told me it was recording. Clear footage, even in darkness. It felt like an invisible ally, a silent witness to whatever might come next. As I buried the cable under fallen leaves and checked the camera housing one last time, I found myself whispering to Helen, "I'm doing this for you too." She would have hated the idea that something built out of love could spark suspicion, but she'd have understood why caution mattered. Later, sitting on the porch as the sun slipped behind the oak, I felt a weight lift from my chest. Not because I'd solved the problem, but because I was no longer waiting passively. The camera wasn't about catching Carol in the act, it was about restoring balance. Her tactics relied on shadows, rumors whispered behind closed doors. Mine relied on light and proof. Part of me still hoped the footage would show nothing. Maybe Carol's notice had been her only shot, and she'd move on. But something deeper inside, call it instinct, or maybe just hard-won caution, told me this wasn't over. That night, I fell asleep with the faint glow of the creek outside my window. The bridge existed only in plans and memory, yet already it had become a line Carol seemed determined to cross. But for the first time in weeks, my sleep felt deeper, steadier. Because even if she came under cover of darkness, she wouldn't come unseen. Helen had once told me, half joking, love can build a bridge, but sometimes a camera keeps it standing. Lying in the quiet darkness, I realized she was right. I wasn't building a monument to grief, I was building a promise, and sometimes promises need defending. Tomorrow would bring what it would bring. But tonight, at least, I knew the truth wouldn't stay buried. 2 mornings later, I stepped outside before sunrise, coffee steaming in my hand. The yard smelled of damp earth and early summer grass, and for a brief moment, everything felt calm, almost normal. But as I reached the creek's edge, my heart caught in my throat. There, planted firmly in the soft ground, stood a bright red sign. Its bold letters shouted a single word: danger. The sign was large enough to catch the eye of anyone walking or driving by. Beneath the headline, smaller print warned of unpermitted, hazardous construction activity. It was deliberately dramatic, worded to spark fear rather than inform. For a few seconds, I just stood there, the breeze tugging at the sign's corners, its shadow cutting across the foundation markers I'd so carefully laid. The message was unmistakable, not just a warning to neighbors, but a warning to me. And the handwriting on the bottom, small, neat, authoritative, matched Carol's from the notes she'd scribbled days earlier. A slow frustration settled in my chest, heavier than anger. Helen's bridge had never been about rebellion. It was about memory, about keeping love alive in the quiet bend of our creek. But Carol had twisted it into something sinister, something to be feared. I glanced at the camera hidden among the evergreens, its small lens unblinking. Its silent witness felt reassuring. Now it wasn't just my word against hers. Evidence, clear, impartial, had become my ally. Stepping closer to the sign, I noticed it had been positioned with surgical precision. Right at the edge of the property line, angled perfectly so neighbors jogging or walking dogs would see it first. The red paint looked fresh, the stake hammered deep to withstand wind and rain. It was, ironically, the work of someone who understood planning and detail. For a moment, my mind drifted to how Helen would have responded. She wasn't naive, she'd taught children after all, and knew how quickly rumor could grow from a whisper into something far larger. But she would have insisted we meet the escalation not with aggression, but with honesty and transparency. So I didn't rip the sign out in a fit of rage, tempting as it was. Instead, I took photos from every angle, timestamped them, and logged the incident. Then quietly, I removed the sign and stored it in the garage, placing it next to the binder containing Carol's fake violation notice. Each piece, I reminded myself, was part of a growing story, a story that eventually would reveal itself for what it was. Later that afternoon, I walked the neighborhood, greeting familiar faces: Mr. Thompson, watering his marigolds; Mrs. Rodriguez, trimming roses by her driveway. Both paused, concern etched across their faces. "Art, we saw a sign by your creek," Mrs. Rodriguez said gently. "Is everything okay?" I nodded, explaining in plain terms: the county permit, the environmental clearance, the memorial for Helen. Their expression softened, shifting from worry to quiet support. "We had a feeling," Mr. Thompson said. "It didn't seem like something you'd do recklessly." Their words were a small comfort, but an important one. Carol's escalation wasn't really aimed at me. It was aimed at everyone else, at sowing doubt and fear before truth could take root. That night, as dusk settled over the yard, I stood by the creek again. The foundation lines, still faintly visible, felt like a promise half-kept. The water whispered around stones, the way Helen's voice had once whispered late at night. The sign, bright red and accusing, now sat quietly in the dark of my garage. Its silence was almost louder than its message had been. Carol had fired her first real shot, turning rumor into a visible threat. But instead of backing down, I felt something new: quiet determination. Helen's bridge would stand, not just because I had the right permits, but because love built from grief can be stronger than fear built from control. The red letters had tried to speak for me. Tomorrow, I'd begin making sure neighbors heard my voice instead. The morning after I removed the red danger sign, the neighborhood felt oddly tense. People still waved as they walked past my house, but there was a hesitation, a flicker of uncertainty in their eyes, as if they were silently asking questions they weren't sure they should voice. By midday, I understood why. It started with a knock on my door from Mrs. Rodriguez, her brow furrowed, phone in hand. "Art," she said gently, "I think you should see this." She turned the screen toward me. There it was, a private Facebook group titled "Protect Our Creek, Neighbors for Safety." The banner image? A poorly lit photo of my construction site taken at an angle that made the creek look muddy and dangerous, the foundation markers crooked and chaotic. And the posts, dozens of them, all by Carol. One warned of an unprotected construction zone where children could fall and be injured. Another accused me of building without proper oversight, risking erosion and property damage. Carol had even shared heavily edited photos, darkened, grainy, and framed to look alarming. To someone who didn't know better, it probably did look dangerous. Scrolling further, I saw she'd written things like, "We have to act before it's too late," and "Imagine what could happen if a child wandered too close." Her words dripped with concern, but underneath was unmistakable manipulation. What struck me most wasn't that Carol was stirring fear, it was how quickly it spread. Neighbors I barely knew had commented things like, "This needs to stop," and I heard he didn't even get approval. Others shared the posts, tagging friends, and suddenly what had been a quiet backyard project was turning into a neighborhood controversy. For a moment, I just stood there, phone in hand, heart pounding. Helen's bridge, a tribute meant to heal, had become a target. And worse, people were starting to believe it. I thanked Mrs. Rodriguez for showing me. Her eyes softened. "I thought you should know," she said quietly. "It didn't sound like you." When she left, I sat on the porch, staring at the creek. My first instinct was to reply to every post, defend myself point by point. But Helen's voice, calm and steady in my memory, reminded me, "Don't argue with rumors. Show the truth." So instead of fighting online, I began building my own narrative. First, I made a large weatherproof sign and posted it by the creek where neighbors walked. On it, I explained plainly, "This is a permitted memorial bridge for my late wife Helen. All county approvals and environmental clearances obtained. Please scan the QR code below to view plans and permits." I spent the afternoon designing a simple website. Nothing fancy, just digital copies of the permits, engineering drawings, and a heartfelt note about why Helen's bridge mattered. I added photos of Helen smiling by the creek, and a short story about the late-night conversations when she dreamed of walking across it together. By evening, the site was live. I shared it quietly with neighbors I trusted, Mrs. Rodriguez, Mr. Thompson, and a few others. If people ask, show them this, I told them. And they did. Slowly, messages of support trickled in. One neighbor stopped by to say, "I saw your site. I'm sorry for your loss, and thank you for sharing." Another offered to help move stones for the bridge. Carol's campaign of fear was built on shadows, half-truths whispered in private groups. But sunlight, I realized, has a way of dissolving shadows. I didn't answer Carol's posts directly. Instead, I let the facts speak. And in those facts, clear permits, honest plans, and Helen's story, people found something real they could trust. That night, sitting on the porch, the creek dark and calm below, I felt something shift. The project had started as my quiet promise to Helen, but it was becoming something larger, a quiet stand against fear itself. Carol had her campaign. But I had truth, memory, and love. And as Helen might have said, in the long run, that wins. The day after launching the website, I woke early, my first thought the same as it had been for weeks, the bridge. But this time, for the first time in days, there wasn't the heavy weight of dread pressing on my chest. Instead, there was purpose. I stood by the creek as the morning light filtered through the trees, reflecting on the strategy I'd chosen. Carol's strength came from secrecy, private groups, selective photos, whispered conversations. Mine would come from the opposite, complete and public transparency. Later that morning, I walked back to the sign I'd posted by the creek. It felt humble, a simple explanation and a QR code, but it was honest, open, and unafraid. I added a small update below. Feel free to contact me directly if you have questions. I'm happy to show plans, permits, or explain in person. That offer wasn't just for formality. I meant it. I wanted neighbors to see the truth for themselves, to feel the same quiet sincerity that Helen and I had once shared on this land. Within a few hours, the response began to ripple through the neighborhood. Mr. Thompson stopped by first, cane in hand. He scanned the code and nodded slowly. "Looks like you've done it by the book," he said. His tone wasn't surprised, it was reassuring, like he'd expected as much. Then Mrs. Rodriguez shared my site on her own page, writing, "Art is building a memorial for his late wife, with county approval and love. Please take a moment to read." Her simple words cut through Carol's carefully curated narrative. One by one, other neighbors began to see beyond Carol's alarmist posts. Some knocked on my door politely, asking questions about the design or whether the creek's flow would change. Each time, I welcomed them in, pulled out the binder of permits, and explained in clear, simple language. They weren't engineers, but they were reasonable people, and facts presented openly spoke louder than rumors. And slowly, I saw the tide turning. Where Carol's posts had once gathered likes and concerned comments, now neighbors began to reply directly, "He has the permits," or "It's a small pedestrian bridge, not a hazard." Some even posted screenshots of my website, gently correcting misinformation. I didn't gloat. Helen wouldn't have liked that. Instead, I felt relief, a soft, quiet kind of relief that maybe, just maybe, the bridge wouldn't stand as a symbol of conflict but as the memorial it was always meant to be. But Carol wasn't finished. A few days later, she updated her posts with even more dramatic language. "Unprotected concrete site threatens local children," alongside new photos taken at odd angles to make the site appear messier and more hazardous than it was. Yet now, the difference was striking. Her words felt desperate rather than authoritative. Neighbors who had visited in person, seen the plans, or read the website quietly commented, "I was there yesterday, it's safe." Others asked, "Have you spoken to Art? He has all the permits." What Carol hadn't expected, and what felt like a small miracle, was that transparency invited people in rather than pushing them away. It turned the conversation from fear into understanding. One evening, standing by the creek, I watched as a few children passed by with their parents. One father pointed to the sign and explained quietly to his daughter about the bridge for a lady who loved the creek. The girl nodded solemnly, as if she understood something deeper than words. In that moment, I realized something simple yet powerful. Carol's campaign had never been about the bridge itself. It was about control, about power over what was built, who built it and why. But by opening my plans, my permits, and even my grief to the neighborhood, I'd taken away her greatest weapon, secrecy. Helen had once told me, half laughing, half serious, "People can twist words, but they can't twist what's right in front of them." She was right. Carol had forced me to choose between silence and openness. And by choosing openness, I found allies where I thought there were only skeptics. The bridge wasn't built yet, but already, its foundation felt stronger than stone. For days after I put up the sign and launched the website, the creek felt quieter, calmer. Neighbors still slowed as they walked by, but their glances had softened, curiosity replacing suspicion. For the first time in weeks, I let myself hope that maybe Carol would retreat, that her energy to fight something built from love would fade. But grief, I'd learned, rarely followed neat timelines, and neither did hostility. That night, I slept lightly, the house silent except for the ticking clock in the hallway. At 3:17 a.m., my hidden camera's motion sensor flickered silently to life. It recorded every frame, every step, every careful move. The next morning before sunrise, I made coffee and checked the footage, my heart oddly calm, as if I'd known what I'd find. And there she was, Carol Peterson herself. The camera's night vision turned her into a ghostly figure, but the outline was unmistakable, mid-40s frame, carefully styled hair pulled back, dark clothes chosen to avoid notice. She moved deliberately, her flashlight beam dancing across the stone piles and stacked lumber. And then, crouched low, she pulled something from her pocket, small, dark shapes, and began scattering them in the dirt, tucking them between stones, hiding them beneath boards. Nails. Screws. Dozens of them, thrown with care into places where I might not see them in the half-light of dawn. Places that could pop tires on my riding mower or puncture my work boots as I hauled stone. Small enough to seem like an accident if found, but dangerous enough to do real harm. She paused, scanning the creek as if to make sure no one was watching. But someone was, the lens steady and unblinking, capturing every moment in crisp detail. When I finished watching, I sat back, hands gripping the mug so tightly the ceramic felt ready to crack. Grief had taught me many things, but one truth rose above them all: love makes you brave, but loss makes you careful. I walked outside, dawn barely breaking, the creek reflecting soft gold light through the mist. And there, just as the footage had shown, lay Carol's quiet sabotage. Twisted nails, sharp screws, some buried so skillfully that I wouldn't have found them if I hadn't known to look. I crouched and gathered them one by one, dropping them into a rusted coffee can. The metal clinked sharply with each new piece, a sound that felt both sad and strangely empowering. Proof, undeniable and cold. But as I worked, a strange calm replaced the anger I'd expected to feel. Carol's late-night sabotage wasn't just about stopping a bridge, it was about testing how far she could push. But now, with the footage saved and backed up, I had something far stronger than anger: evidence. After clearing every last screw, I walked back to the porch and sat quietly, the can beside me. Birds began to call across the yard, the creek's gentle gurgle unchanged by the night's ugliness. And in that sound, I heard something comforting. Carol could scatter nails and spread rumors, but she couldn't change what the bridge meant. Helen's bridge had become more than a memorial, it was now a quiet stand against manipulation and fear. I transferred the footage to 3 flash drives, labeled each carefully, and placed them in separate drawers. One, I kept ready to bring to Sheriff Maddox. The other 2 were insurance, because Carol had shown me something vital. Her campaign wasn't built on one big act of sabotage, it was built on a series of small, deliberate steps, each meant to go unseen. That night, sitting by the creek under the same oak tree where Helen had once traced the bridge's outline in the air, I realized, Carol thought no one would see. But grief had taught me to look closely, to prepare quietly, and to never mistake silence for weakness. The bridge still hadn't risen from stone, but in that moment, I felt closer to Helen than I had in weeks. Because even in the dark, the truth had a witness, and love, stubborn and patient, had found its own way to fight back. Just days after discovering Carol's late-night sabotage with nails and screws, I thought maybe the worst had passed. After all, she'd been caught on camera. Surely, I reasoned, she'd realize the risk of being seen again. But grief had taught me something else too. When someone is driven not just by annoyance, but by obsession, reason rarely slows them down. 5 days later, the morning air felt heavy with humidity. Storm clouds gathered low over the hills, promising an afternoon downpour. I'd planned to pour the concrete footings that week, using 4 specialty concrete bags stacked neatly by the creek, each bag nearly 50 pounds, specially formulated to cure in damp conditions. Not cheap, about $500 worth in total, but necessary for the bridge's foundation to last through decades of freeze and thaw. That afternoon, I checked the camera footage again, as had become my new routine. At first, nothing but branches swaying in the breeze and drifting leaves. But then, at 11:42 p.m. a flicker of movement, Carol again. Dressed in dark clothing, flashlight in one hand and something sharp glinting in the other. She moved slowly, deliberately, like a surgeon rather than a vandal. The camera's infrared lens caught every detail as she crouched over the concrete bags, blade in hand, slicing each one open. Powder spilled out in ragged lines as she moved from bag to bag, pausing to check her work. It wasn't quick, angry destruction, it was methodical, careful. She turned her flashlight on each cut, making sure the damage was complete before moving on. When she finished, she stepped back, flashlight beam sweeping across the scene one last time, and then she disappeared into the darkness. Watching it unfold made my stomach tighten in a way nails never had. This wasn't an attempt to frighten me or slow me down. It was an attempt to stop the project entirely by hitting me where it hurt most: cost. The storm rolled in just hours later, rain soaking the ruined bags, turning the specialty mix into a heavy, useless mess. By morning, concrete that could have formed Helen's foundation was nothing but hardened, lumpy waste. I walked through the mud, water dripping from the brim of my hat, and looked at the damage. Each cut bag was heavy with water, impossible to lift without tearing further. I opened one gently, confirming what I already knew: ruined beyond saving. For a moment, grief and anger blended together, as sharp as the blade Carol had used. This wasn't just sabotage, it was erasure, an attempt to wipe away Helen's dream before it could even rise from the ground. But as I stood there, rain running cold down my collar, I realized Carol had made a mistake. Her previous sabotage was meant to look like an accident, nails scattered by chance. But this? Caught on camera, blade in hand, methodical and unmistakable. There was no way to explain it away as carelessness. I cleaned up what I could, hauling the bags one by one to a tarp to prevent further mess. The wet powder clung to my gloves, turning my hands ghostly white. It felt heavy, both literally and in my chest, a weight that wasn't just concrete, but the burden of fighting for something built out of grief and love. That night, I copied the footage to my 3 flash drives, labeling it Concrete Sabotage, Night 2. Each label felt both somber and strangely empowering. Carol's war wasn't invisible anymore. Later, sitting by the window, watching rain ripple across the creek, I felt Helen's absence more sharply than ever. But I also felt her quiet courage beside me. Carol could slash bags, spread rumors, and plant nails, but she couldn't cut the reason why I was building. The cost would rise, the work would slow, but love, as Helen might have whispered, is stubborn by design. And stubborn, I promised her silently, I would remain. By the time the ruined concrete bags had hardened into useless lumps, my patience had hardened too, into resolve. Carol's quiet campaign had shifted from rumor and intimidation into something criminal. And now I had proof so clear it felt like a stone in my pocket. Video of her, under cover of darkness, blade in hand, destroying something that wasn't hers. That afternoon, after washing concrete dust from my hands and changing into a clean shirt, I drove to the county sheriff's office. The building itself was modest, brick-fronted, American flag fluttering on a short pole out front. Inside, it smelled faintly of coffee and paperwork. At the reception counter, I asked to speak with Sheriff Maddox. He was in his late 50s, with a square jaw softened by years of quiet listening rather than shouting. I'd only met him once before, at a town meeting Helen and I had attended about local zoning, but I remembered his calm, steady presence. When he walked into the small interview room, he offered a firm handshake. "Art, what brings you in today?" he asked. I placed one of the flash drives on the table between us, sliding it across slowly. "I've got footage," I said, voice level but tight, "of my neighbor destroying $500 worth of building materials on my property. It's not the first time she's come at night." Sheriff Maddox didn't interrupt. He plugged the drive into his laptop and watched the video in silence. Frame by frame, Carol's figure moved across the screen, flashlight, blade, deliberate slashes. When it ended, he exhaled and leaned back. "That's clear as day," he said. "You know this is a felony, right? Destruction of property, premeditated." Possibly even attempted harm if she meant to injure someone with the nails earlier. I nodded. I do. But I don't want her arrested just yet, I told him, surprising even myself a little. He raised an eyebrow. That so? I explained. Carol had been escalating, testing boundaries, growing bolder each time I refused to back down. If we confronted her now, she might spin it into another neighborhood drama, claim misunderstanding, or even hide further sabotage. But if she kept going, the evidence would only grow stronger, making it undeniable. I don't want revenge, I said quietly. This bridge is for my wife, Helen. It's about memory and peace, not conflict. But I do want her to stop, and if she won't, I want to be ready to make it impossible for her to deny what she's done. Sheriff Maddox studied me for a long moment, fingers steepled under his chin. Finally, he nodded. All right. We let her keep digging her own hole. But if there's any sign of danger to you or anyone else, you call me immediately. Understood? Understood, I agreed, relief mingling with resolve. He offered one final piece of advice: document everything: dates, times, receipts, footage. Judges don't care how upset someone made you, they care about facts. And Art? Stay calm. You're doing this right. Driving home, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. It wasn't that the threat was gone, it wasn't, but now, it wasn't just me against Carol's crusade. I had the law on my side, and evidence that spoke louder than rumor. When I pulled back into the driveway, the creek shimmered under late afternoon sun, quiet and patient. I stood at its edge, thinking of Helen, how she would have smiled gently and told me to keep going. Carol's sabotage had been meant to break me, to drain my will until stopping felt easier than fighting. Instead, it had pushed me toward action, forced me to gather allies and proof. That evening, I walked the property with new eyes, not as someone under siege, but as someone quietly preparing for truth to emerge, no matter how dark the night before. Love had built the reason. Grief had built the resolve. And now, stone by stone, law and evidence would protect the bridge that memory demanded I build. Even with Sheriff Maddox now quietly in my corner, a nagging question tugged at the back of my mind. Why was Carol so confident? Most people, once caught vandalizing and spreading lies, might at least pause. But Carol hadn't slowed. If anything, she'd grown bolder, almost as if she knew something I didn't. That question kept me awake at night, staring out the window toward the darkened creek where Helen's bridge would one day stand. Then one restless dawn it came to me, maybe Carol believed she had leverage I wasn't aware of. Something that would justify, at least in her mind, the lengths she'd gone to. So I decided to dig deeper, literally. That same morning, I called Precision Boundaries, a respected local land survey company. The receptionist was kind, her voice calm and professional. Even when I explained the situation, there's tension with my neighbor, I admitted, and I'd like to confirm the exact property lines. She scheduled a survey team for later that week. 2 days later, the surveyors arrived, 2 middle-aged men in reflective vests, quiet and methodical. They unpacked equipment near the creek, tripods, GPS markers, and metal detectors, and set to work while I watched from the porch. The afternoon felt strangely tense. As they moved slowly around my yard, one of the men glanced toward Carol's property. Her patio, adorned with white trellises and climbing roses, sat close to where my yard sloped toward the creek. Too close, I thought suddenly. Could that be it? By evening, the team finished their measurements and packed up. We'll finalize the report, one of them told me, but there's something you should see right away. In the soft golden light, he pulled out a rough sketch from his clipboard. My eyes traced the bold new boundary lines, and my breath caught. The original 1987 survey, the one Carol and I both had on file, was off by about 15 feet. It had misaligned a curve in the creek, and the corrected boundary now cut directly through Carol's prized patio and her rose garden, land she'd been treating as hers for decades. My backyard, it turned out, legally stretched further than anyone had realized. And Carol? She'd been enjoying, decorating, and building on land that belonged to me. The discovery settled into my chest like a heavy stone. Not anger, exactly, more a grim understanding. Carol's boldness wasn't random. It had been an unspoken calculation. She feared what might happen if the boundary was ever challenged. So instead, she'd gone on the offensive, trying to pressure, discredit, and sabotage me into giving up, all before the truth could surface. That evening, I sat on the porch, the fresh survey map in my lap. The soft breeze rustled the leaves overhead, and I found myself speaking quietly to Helen's memory. We didn't ask for this, love, but now we know. It wasn't just about a few feet of soil. Legally, Carol had built permanent improvements, her patio and landscaping, on my land without permission. The costs to remove them, and potential damages, were hers to bear. I had never wanted this fight, but Carol had forced my hand. And now, the power dynamic had shifted. After nightfall, I stored the survey report carefully beside the flash drives containing the sabotage footage. The evidence was stacking up, not as weapons for revenge, but as shields against further attack. Carol could no longer claim moral high ground. Her entire narrative rested on land that wasn't legally hers. And yet, sitting quietly beside the creek, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt resolute. Because at the heart of it, the fight was never about a property line or HOA politics. It was about building something for Helen, something rooted in love, that fear and rumor couldn't tear down. The next step was clear: I needed legal counsel. But tonight, for the first time in weeks, I slept without that knot of uncertainty. The truth had always been on my side. Now, finally, I had the proof in hand. The morning after the survey results landed like a quiet bombshell, I sat at the kitchen table, the report spread before me. My coffee went cold as I read the bold boundary lines again and again, tracing where my property legally extended under Carol's patio and rose garden. The lines weren't drawn in anger, they were drawn in fact. Yet I knew that fact could carry consequences. It was time to understand those consequences fully. I searched for a real estate attorney, wanting someone who knew property disputes inside and out, and who could see through HOA politics. After a few calls, one name came up more than once: Sarah Martinez. Sarah's office was in a small converted craftsman house downtown. Inside, shelves lined with thick law books, framed walls decorated with calming watercolors, oceans, rivers, quiet streams. The kind of place that felt steady, unhurried, which matched Sarah herself, mid-50s, sharp-eyed behind understated glasses, her handshake firm but warm. I explained everything: Helen's passing, the memorial bridge, Carol's escalating sabotage, and finally, the survey revealing my property line cut deep into Carol's prized backyard improvements. Sarah listened without interrupting, scribbling notes in a slim leather notebook. When I finished, the room settled into silence, broken only by the faint ticking of a clock on her bookshelf. "You've done more groundwork than most clients ever do," she finally said, voice calm but edged with quiet respect. "And your instinct to document everything?" That was exactly right. She walked me through the legal reality. Carol had built permanent structures, her patio and rose garden, on land she didn't own. Under property law, that made her liable for removal costs and potentially for damages if the encroachment devalued my property. Worse for Carol, the improvements had never been permitted by the county or HOA, making her vulnerable if this ever reached court. I nodded, absorbing it all, but Sarah's eyes caught mine. "Before you start thinking about tearing up her patio," she said gently, "ask yourself, what do you really want?" I thought about that. The truth was, I didn't care about reclaiming every inch of lawn or tearing down her garden. What I wanted was simple: to finish Helen's bridge in peace, without sabotage, rumor, or late-night vandalism. Sarah leaned back, recognizing my silence for what it meant. "Leverage," she said softly. "That's what this gives you, not revenge. If Carol keeps pushing, you have undeniable evidence of criminal acts and proof she's encroaching. She loses credibility, and you gain a position from which to negotiate or defend yourself." We discussed next steps. She drafted a formal letter outlining the new survey and Carol's encroachment, to be used only if Carol escalated. If needed, we could file for injunctive relief, compelling Carol to stop interfering or even remove her patio, but only if absolutely necessary. I left Sarah's office with copies of the survey, the draft letter, and a clearer sense of what the path ahead might look like. My steps felt steadier. This wasn't about striking back, it was about building something, and protecting it, not just the stones and mortar of Helen's bridge, but the intent that had given it life. That night, I walked along the creek's bend where the bridge would soon stand. The late sun painted ripples across the water, and for a quiet moment, I let myself picture the bridge finished: fieldstone arch, roses climbing its sides, and Helen's plaque catching the morning light. Carol's patio sat just across the property line, her roses spilling over like a silent metaphor. But now, I knew exactly where the line lay, and what it meant. Not as a threat, but as quiet assurance that I had the law and truth on my side. Grief had built the bridge's foundation. Love kept me building it. And now knowledge, and the calm strength of someone like Sarah, would guard it until it stood, stone by stone, in memory of Helen. With Sarah's legal guidance and the survey results secured in my files, something inside me shifted from defensive to determined. The bridge was no longer just an idea born of grief. It had become a testament to perseverance, proof that love, memory, and patience could outlast rumor and sabotage. The last major step before laying the fieldstone was compacting the creek bed to ensure the foundation wouldn't shift over time. As an engineer, I knew this phase would be loud, dusty, and impossible to hide, a perfect opportunity for Carol to stage another scene. So, I prepared carefully. First, I rented a compact road roller from Morrison Heavy Equipment, a sturdy, rumbling machine designed for small construction projects. I scheduled its arrival for a Saturday afternoon, when most neighbors would be home and likely watching. But instead of hiding the work, I leaned into transparency. 2 days before, I drafted a short, neighborly letter explaining the plan. This weekend, I'll be using a road roller to compact the creek bed for Helen's Memorial Bridge. All permits and environmental clearances are on file. Thank you for your understanding and support. I printed copies and slipped them into mailboxes up and down the street. Some neighbors even thanked me in person. Mr. Thompson raised a hand from his porch and said, "Good luck, Art. Hope it goes smoothly." Small words, but they meant more than he knew. Next, I called Sheriff Maddox. I explained my concern. Carol might use the noise and attention to spark another public confrontation. "Would you mind being nearby, just in case?" I asked. His response was simple: "I'll be there at 2, watching quietly." Finally, I emailed Sarah, outlining what might happen and attaching the survey, the sabotage footage, and copies of my permits. "If anything escalates," I wrote, "I'll call you immediately." Her reply came quickly: "Good. Stay calm, document everything, and don't take the bait." The morning of the work arrived with bright blue skies and a breeze carrying the scent of wet earth and summer flowers. At 1 p.m., the road roller rumbled off the delivery truck, its yellow paint dusty but powerful. The operator showed me how to start, stop, and steer. My pulse quickened as I stepped onto the platform. This wasn't an engineer's desk work anymore. This was real physical progress. As I maneuvered the machine toward the creek bed, I caught sight of Carol standing on her patio. Phone in hand, camera aimed at me, her lips tight. Her body language radiated tension, as if rehearsing what she'd say the moment I slipped up. The neighbors, drawn by the noise, began to gather, Mrs. Rodriguez with her sun hat, Mr. Thompson leaning on his cane, a few curious teenagers filming for social media. My sign explaining the memorial project stood by the creek, the QR code still visible and freshly laminated against dust. I paused the roller, waved politely at the crowd, and pointed to the sign. A few neighbors smiled back, reading the explanation, their expressions softening. By 2 p.m., as planned, Sheriff Maddox appeared, parking discreetly 2 blocks down and walking over. He didn't speak right away. He just stood beside Mrs. Rodriguez, arms folded, observing. His calm presence felt like an invisible shield. Inside the roller's cab, the engine's low vibration rattled my ribs, but my mind felt clear. Each slow pass over the creek bed tamped down not just loose earth, but months of grief, frustration, and whispered rumors. As the work continued, I saw Carol pacing on her patio, phone still recording, occasionally pointing toward the creek as if narrating her outrage to an unseen audience. But now it felt different. Her movement seemed frantic rather than authoritative, her confidence visibly cracking under the weight of the evidence and support I'd quietly built. By late afternoon, sweat soaking through my shirt, the creek bed lay compacted and ready, a flat, solid canvas waiting for fieldstone and mortar. The bridge had moved from dream to tangible foundation. As I turned off the machine and stepped down, neighbors clapped politely, not for the machine but I sensed for the calm resolve that had brought us here. The final phase had begun. And this time, I wasn't building alone. With the creek bed now compacted and ready for stone, the bridge was finally poised to rise from the earth. But experience had taught me that each step forward drew Carol closer, like a moth to flame. Her pattern was clear. Whenever visible progress happened, she escalated, from rumors to sabotage, from private whispers to public theatrics. So before starting the next phase, laying the stone arch, I decided it was time to set a trap. Not out of malice, but to stop her spiral of sabotage before it could undo everything. I spent a quiet evening at my dining table, plans and permits spread out before me, a legal pad in hand. On it, I sketched out what I needed: visibility, documentation, and authority. The plan took shape as naturally as any engineering blueprint, simple but precise. The centerpiece was the compact road roller itself, heavy, noisy, impossible to miss, and a perfect magnet for Carol's attention. I scheduled its next use for Saturday at 2 p.m., right when neighbors were likely to be home. The day before, I called Sheriff Maddox. "I'd like you to be present," I explained, "not to intervene immediately, but to observe. Carol might confront me publicly, and I'd rather it happen with law enforcement nearby." His calm response felt like a steel beam beneath my plan. "Understood, Art. I'll be there, watching." Next, I emailed Sarah, my attorney, attaching the full plan, copies of the sabotage footage, and the survey showing Carol's encroachment. Her reply came quickly, direct but supportive: "If she confronts you, stay calm, state facts, and document. Call me if it escalates." Finally, I set up a second camera, this time, hidden on the fence line facing Carol's patio, its lens aimed where she usually stood filming. I didn't want confrontation. I wanted a clear, unbiased record. Saturday arrived warm and bright. At noon, the road roller trundled down my driveway, the operator handing me the keys. Its engine rumbled low, vibrating through the creek bed as I climbed aboard. I took a breath, hands steady on the controls. Around me, neighbors gathered, drawn by the noise and curiosity. Mrs. Rodriguez waved gently. Mr. Thompson settled on a folding chair he'd brought from home, cane resting on his knee. At 1:45 p.m., as planned, Sheriff Maddox parked discreetly 2 blocks down, then walked over, hands folded behind his back. He stood quietly near the crowd, saying nothing but scanning the scene with calm authority. And then, right on cue, Carol emerged from her patio. Phone in hand, face flushed with determination, she filmed my every move, her voice carrying across the lawn: "This is an illegal project. He's destroying the creek. Stop." At exactly 2 p.m., as the roller's engine growled low, Carol stormed down from her patio and crossed onto my side of the property line, her footsteps sinking slightly into the freshly compacted soil. She planted herself directly in front of the roller, phone aimed at me, her voice rising. "You need to stop this now. You have no right, no HOA approval, you're ruining the environment." Her words spilled over themselves, frantic but practiced. Neighbors shifted uneasily, the hum of the roller and Carol's shouts blending into an oddly tense chorus. Some filmed, some simply watched, but all eyes were on her. I kept the roller idling, engine rumbling under my feet, and lifted my hands to show I wasn't advancing. Calmly, I spoke, voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear: "I have county permits, HOA covenants don't prohibit this, and this is a memorial for my late wife. You're trespassing, Carol." Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, when I said trespassing. But then her voice grew louder, her performance sharpening as she turned the phone back to the crowd. In that instant, Sheriff Maddox stepped forward. His presence, quiet but unmistakable, parted the tension like a blade. He didn't shout. Instead, in a measured voice, he addressed Carol: "Ma'am, you're trespassing on Mr. Holloway's property and obstructing permitted work. That's a crime." Carol turned to face him, phone shaking slightly in her hand. But he's breaking the law. Sheriff Maddox shook his head, calm and resolute. "We've reviewed his permits. He's well within his rights." Neighbors watched, phones out, the balance of power shifting in real time. Carol's livestream, meant to rally outrage, was capturing her own trespass instead. In that moment, the trap wasn't about catching her in a crime, it was about catching the truth on record, in front of everyone. For the first time, Carol's mask of certainty cracked, and the crowd saw it, live and undeniable. For a long suspended moment, the yard felt frozen in time. The hum of the road roller idled low behind me, its vibration pulsing through the ground. Carol stood barely 20 feet away, phone raised like a shield, her eyes locked on Sheriff Maddox. And around us, a semicircle of neighbors watched, phones lifted, curiosity and disbelief etched on their faces. At first, Carol tried to keep her composure. She turned her livestream back toward herself, voice strained but measured. "As you can see, I'm here protecting the neighborhood from illegal construction destroying our precious creek. Her words trailed off as she caught sight of Sheriff Maddox's uniform just over her shoulder, reflected faintly on her phone's screen. Then reality finally overtook the script she'd prepared. "No," she snapped, her voice cracking mid-sentence. "You can't just stand there and do nothing. He's a danger, don't you people see that?" Her hand trembled, making the video shaky and wild. Neighbors shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Rodriguez glanced at Mr. Thompson, who just shook his head slowly, as if disappointed rather than surprised. Carol's words tumbled out faster, each breath sharper, like a cornered animal lashing out. "He's lying. He's been harassing me, threatening me, destroying the environment. This creek is delicate, you're all blind." But even as she shouted, her voice betrayed something she couldn't hide: panic. The authority she'd wielded for months, through rumor, fake violations, and late-night sabotage, slipped away with each frantic word. I kept my voice calm, the roller engine idling behind me. "Carol, you're trespassing. The permits are public, and you know it. Please step back to your property." The camera on my fence caught the moment her mask truly cracked. Her expression twisted, rage mixing with disbelief. "You don't get to tell me what to do. This whole neighborhood, this is my responsibility. Not yours. You and your stupid memorial." She cut herself off, chest heaving. For a brief, brutal heartbeat, silence hung over the crowd. My heart clenched at her words, stupid memorial, as if Helen's memory itself had become just another target in Carol's campaign. But that silence didn't save her, it only made her next outburst echo louder. "You people don't understand. Property values, environmental damage, he's ruining everything." Her voice pitched higher with every word, desperation sharpening each syllable. "This bridge isn't about love, it's about him. He just wants attention." Neighbors glanced at one another, faces stiffening into something like quiet judgment. Even through her live stream, viewers began to see what stood in front of them, not a protector of community, but a neighbor unraveling under the weight of her own campaign. Sheriff Maddox stepped forward, his tone firm but still calm. "Ma'am, you need to move back to your property line right now, or you'll be charged with trespassing and obstruction." For a breath, Carol just stared at him, jaw slack, as if she hadn't imagined this outcome. Then she whirled back toward her phone, voice cracking fully. "Do you see this? The sheriff is siding with him. They're all against me." But this time, there were no nods, no murmurs of agreement. Only the quiet shuffle of neighbors lowering their phones, sympathy replaced by weary disbelief. Her meltdown wasn't dramatic triumph. It was raw, messy, and painfully human, a woman cornered by facts she couldn't twist anymore. Finally, realizing the moment had turned irreversibly against her, Carol took a stumbling step backward, her eyes wet, voice falling to a hoarse rasp. "This isn't over," she muttered, barely loud enough for the nearest neighbors to hear. Then she turned and walked stiffly back toward her patio, live stream still running, but words gone. The yard exhaled as one. The roller engine thrummed in the background, the only sound left to fill the space where her accusations had echoed seconds before. I turned off the machine, heart pounding not with triumph, but with quiet relief. The crowd dispersed slowly, neighbors glancing back at Carol's retreating figure. Some offered nods of quiet support, a few even muttered about time. And standing there, hands still dusty from work, I felt something settle into place. Not victory over Carol, but the knowledge that her power had finally been broken by her own hand, in front of the very people she'd once convinced. For a few seconds after Carol's retreat, the yard held its breath, a quiet broken only by the hum of the idle road roller and the soft rustle of wind through creekside reeds. I stepped off the roller, boots crunching over packed earth, my heartbeat drumming hard against my ribs. Sheriff Maddox turned toward me, his expression steady but edged with something like weary relief. "You all right, Art?" he asked, voice calm as ever. "I'm fine," I said, though my voice caught slightly on the words. "Just glad it didn't get worse." He nodded, scanning the remaining neighbors clustered nearby, Mrs. Rodriguez still holding her sun hat, Mr. Thompson leaning heavily on his cane. A few younger neighbors had filmed everything on their phones. I could see them quietly replaying the footage, frowning at Carol's outburst. Then Sheriff Maddox raised his voice, loud enough for everyone to hear but not harsh. "Folks, just so there's no confusion," he said, turning deliberately so Carol's patio was still in view, "Mr. Holloway's project has county approval, and he's operating entirely within the law. The HOA covenants don't prohibit what he's building. And yes, I've reviewed the permits myself. A murmur rippled through the group, part relief, part confirmation of what many had begun to suspect. Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, "Thank goodness," under her breath. Maddox continued, hands folded calmly in front of him. "Trespassing, obstructing permitted construction, and especially sabotage, those aren't neighborhood disputes, those are crimes. And I'd advise anyone thinking about interfering again to reconsider." Though he never named her, everyone knew the warning was for Carol. From her patio, she stood stiffly, phone still in hand, expression caught somewhere between fury and disbelief. One neighbor, a man I only knew by sight from the next block, raised his hand hesitantly. "Sheriff, what if the HOA tries to stop the project?" Maddox shook his head. "The HOA can't override county-issued permits. They'd have to go through court, and given the documentation Mr. Holloway has, they'd likely lose. What's being built here isn't dangerous. It's not a dam or commercial structure, it's a small memorial bridge. Let's keep perspective." His words had a quiet power, the kind that cut through rumor more effectively than any argument I could have made. And spoken in front of neighbors, they turned Carol's narrative upside down. I cleared my throat, voice still steady despite my pulse. "I just want to finish this bridge for Helen," I said simply, meeting the eyes of the people around me. "I'm not trying to hurt anyone or change the neighborhood. Just to keep a promise." For a moment, silence settled, softer this time, like acceptance. A couple of neighbors nodded. Mrs. Rodriguez patted my arm gently, her eyes kind. Then Maddox turned back to Carol. "Ma'am," he called, his tone measured but unmistakably firm. "If you trespass on Mr. Holloway's property again or interfere with his work, I will have no choice but to charge you. Do you understand?" Carol didn't answer. Her phone lowered slightly, hands trembling as if the device had grown suddenly heavy. Her face flushed, mouth opened as if to protest, but no words came. Finally, she turned away, stepping back toward her rose garden. With quiet finality, Sheriff Maddox added, "This is your warning. Don't make me come back." The weight in those words was undeniable, not shouted, but solid as bedrock. Neighbors began to drift away, some glancing back at Carol, others offering me small nods or murmured support. The spell she'd held over them through rumor, fear, and authoritative tone had cracked, then crumbled completely under the daylight of evidence and calm truth. As the sheriff walked back toward his cruiser, he paused beside me. "Art," he said quietly, "finish your bridge. You've handled this with more patience than most would." I thanked him, voice rough with relief. And as his patrol car pulled away, the yard felt different, lighter, calmer, and closer to what Helen had dreamed. A quiet place, free of conflict, meant for peace and memory. Carol still stood on her patio, but her posture had changed. Where before she'd been the neighborhood's self-appointed guardian, now she was just a neighbor, facing the limits of her power. And for the first time since Helen's passing, I felt that the promise I'd made, to honor her with something lasting, was finally within reach. When the sheriff's cruiser disappeared around the bend, the air felt oddly still, as if the very trees by the creek were catching their breath. The hum of the road roller had faded to silence, leaving behind only the soft rustle of leaves and the distant trill of birdsong. Carol stood frozen on her patio, phone still clutched loosely in one hand. Her face, usually set in confident authority, had softened into something unguarded, part disbelief, part quiet panic. The live comments scrolling on her phone must have turned, just as the crowd's mood had turned minutes earlier. For weeks, she had lived inside her own narrative, a righteous protector saving the neighborhood from imagined destruction. But now, her words had collided head-on with reality, in front of the very neighbors she once swayed. One by one, people drifted away, but not silently. Mrs. Rodriguez walked past Carol's property line, shaking her head gently, murmuring to a friend, "Poor woman's lost her way." Mr. Thompson, always slow and deliberate, paused at the edge of my driveway to catch my eye. "She overplayed her hand," he said quietly. About time someone stood up to it. Even the teenagers who had filmed the confrontation scrolled through their videos, their expressions more curious than sympathetic. Carol had wanted an audience, and now she had one. But it wasn't clapping. For my part, I didn't feel triumphant. Watching her, shoulders drooped under the weight of public embarrassment, I saw not an enemy vanquished, but a person cornered by her own choices. It felt strangely sad, like seeing someone wake up and realize too late what they'd become. She glanced up from her phone, eyes scanning the emptying street, as if searching for anyone still willing to nod in agreement. No one did. Even her closest allies from the HOA Architectural Committee were conspicuously absent, avoiding her gaze, suddenly busy with phone calls or quick goodbyes. Carol tried to salvage the moment. She lifted the phone back to eye level, her voice thin but forceful. "You all saw it. This isn't over. He's breaking rules, destroying habitat," but the words stumbled, sounded hollow. Without the sheriff's support and without neighbors nodding along, they hung in the summer air like smoke and dissolved just as quickly. Her live stream comments must have turned harsh, because her mouth tightened, shoulders rising defensively. Then, as if the device itself betrayed her, she lowered it, thumb hovering over the screen before the video cut off abruptly. For a few heartbeats, she simply stood there, backlit by the white trellises of her rose garden, roses that now, ironically, bloomed on land the survey showed wasn't hers. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. When she finally turned, it wasn't the brisk, self-assured pivot neighbors knew. It was slower, smaller. She crossed her patio with deliberate care, as though each step cost her something. From my vantage by the creek, sweat still drying on my shirt, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. The confrontation was over, but the deeper conflict lingered in the yard's stillness. Carol had built her authority on certainty, an unwavering confidence that no one would dare push back. Today, that foundation cracked, and everyone had seen the fissure. As she disappeared inside her house, the patio door shut behind her with a soft click. It didn't sound defiant, it sounded final. I turned back to my work area, the compacted creek bed waiting patiently for the next stage. The roses Helen had planted years ago leaned slightly toward the sun, oblivious to human drama. A small breeze ruffled their petals, carrying their scent faintly across the yard. Neighbors passing by offered small words of encouragement. "Hang in there, Art," one said. "It's a beautiful tribute," another murmured. Each comment felt like mortar setting between the stones of Helen's bridge, binding grief, memory, and quiet defiance into something stronger than rumor. Carol's humiliation wasn't the end. But it was the turning point, the moment when her voice stopped being the loudest, and the truth, at last, had room to breathe. Just when I thought Carol might finally retreat, regroup, or let go, she proved again that some people don't know when to stop. Her public meltdown hadn't ended the fight, it had only changed the battlefield. 2 days later, bright flyers appeared in mailboxes across the neighborhood, printed on thick, glossy paper. Emergency HOA meeting topic: protecting our creek and property values from illegal construction, in bold red letters. It continued: proposal to authorize $50,000 HOA lawsuit against Art Holloway for environmental destruction and unapproved building. At the bottom, Carol's name stood out as the organizer, along with a location, the community center, Wednesday evening at 6 p.m. Holding the flyer, I felt that familiar mix of dread and resignation, but also quiet resolve. Carol's meltdown had lost her sympathy, but she still had procedural weapons, bylaws, emergency meetings, and the power to whip up fear. And $50,000 wasn't pocket change. It was enough to scare reasonable neighbors into voting yes, just to protect the neighborhood. For a brief moment, I imagined what Helen might say. Probably something calm, steady: "Facts, Art. Just show them the truth." And so that's what I decided to do. I gathered my arsenal, not of anger, but of paper and proof. The county permits. The environmental clearance. The survey showing Carol's patio encroached on my property. Photos, diagrams, and crucially, the video clips of Carol's sabotage and meltdown. Wednesday arrived humid and tense. The community center's parking lot overflowed, neighbors milling around in tight clusters, flyers folded in anxious hands. Inside, folding chairs formed neat rows facing a makeshift podium where Carol, in a crisp navy blazer, arranged her notes. I slipped into a seat near the aisle, documents organized in a slim black folder on my lap. Around me, whispers floated: "Is this really about the creek? $50,000. That's a lot. Didn't he get permits?" At exactly 6 p.m., Carol stepped forward, voice carefully modulated, polished. Gone was the frantic tone from her live stream. In its place, the old practiced authority. She gestured toward a projector screen behind her. "Neighbors," she began, "we face a grave threat. Mr. Holloway's unapproved stone bridge risks flooding, harms local wildlife, and most of all, endangers our property values." She clicked through a slideshow of exaggerated dark-angled photos, piles of fieldstone looking like rubble, the road roller parked ominously by the creek, and a single photo of me mid-work, sweat-soaked and blurry, framed as if caught in the act. Some neighbors frowned, others leaned forward, concerned. Carol's voice tightened at key moments, pulling at threads of fear. "Think of your children," she urged. "Think of your home's resale value." Finally, she concluded, "I propose we vote tonight to authorize legal action, up to $50,000, to force him to stop." She paused, eyes sweeping the room. In the silence, she looked almost relieved, as though certain her words had landed. Then I rose, folder in hand, heart pounding so loud it felt like it echoed in the hall. "May I speak?" I asked, voice calm but firm. Carol hesitated, lips pressed tight. Then, with forced politeness, "You have 2 minutes." I stepped to the front, unfolding each document carefully. "I understand you're concerned," I began. "But here are county-issued permits, environmental approvals, and engineering plans, all filed and approved." I held them high, turning so every row could see. Next, I projected the survey showing Carol's patio and rose garden on my land. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Carol's posture stiffened, her practiced calm slipping. "And here," I said quietly, "is security footage of sabotage, someone scattering nails, slashing concrete bags, trespassing at night. Same person who now wants $50,000 of your money to sue me." I let the frame freeze on Carol's face, caught mid-act. The silence that followed wasn't hostile. It was heavy, thoughtful, shifting. Neighbors glanced at one another, brows raised. Mrs. Rodriguez whispered, "Oh my." Carol tried to speak, words caught in her throat. The authority she'd wielded so easily now seemed fragile, paper-thin. In that moment, the facts did what anger and rumor never could. They spoke for themselves. The vote was called. Hands rose, almost all against the lawsuit. And just like that, Carol's last attempt to stop Helen's bridge failed, not because I shouted the loudest, but because truth finally had the floor. For weeks, I'd held onto the new survey quietly, like a card up my sleeve. It wasn't something I wanted to use. It felt heavy, even cruel, proof that part of Carol's treasured patio and rose garden, her pride, her refuge, had been built, unknowingly or not, on my land. But after her push for a $50,000 lawsuit, it became clear, polite boundaries wouldn't stop her. Rumor and intimidation were her tools, and truth was the only answer left. The emergency HOA meeting had already turned tense. Carol's slideshow had stoked worry, dark photos, warnings about flooding and resale values. Then I stepped up, calm but resolute, and shared the facts, permits, footage of sabotage, the boundary survey. The survey was my nuclear option, not in anger, but in self-defense. It showed in black and white, a 15-foot overlap where Carol's patio, fence, and even parts of her rose garden encroached across the legal property line. When the projector clicked to that slide, the room seemed to freeze. The map was clean and professional, labeled in precise engineer script, the bold red property line cutting across Carol's improvements like a quiet verdict. You could almost hear the intake of breath as neighbors leaned in, reading what it meant. I didn't raise my voice. "According to precision boundaries," I explained, "Carol's patio and garden sit partly on my property. This isn't speculation, it's certified and filed with the county." Carol's face paled, lips parting as if to speak, but nothing came out. For a heartbeat, silence. Then whispers spread, soft and sharp. "Wait, she built over his line? All this time? And she wanted to sue him?" I could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't about punishment, it was about perspective. Carol had spent months accusing me of damaging the neighborhood. Yet here, in quiet numbers and ink, was proof that she'd crossed the line, literally and legally. I raised my gaze to meet hers. Her expression flickered, shock, then denial, then something close to fear. The confident tone she'd wielded so easily just hours before was gone, replaced by raw vulnerability. "I'm not asking for her patio to be torn down," I continued, my voice softening deliberately. "I don't want to sue her. I just want to finish the memorial bridge my wife dreamed of, a bridge that's on my side of the property." A hush settled again, thicker this time. Neighbors exchanged looks that said more than words could: sympathy for me, realization about Carol. Even those who'd been quietly neutral seemed to shift. Carol tried to recover. "That survey must be wrong," she snapped, voice cracking. "It's fake, he paid someone." But the moment had already turned. I held up the signed certification, stamped and sealed. "Filed with the county," I said. "Anyone here can request a copy. It's public record." Someone near the back muttered, "Wow," low and long, and the ripple spread. Carol's protest died mid-breath. In that single reveal, the narrative Carol had built for months collapsed under its own weight. She wasn't a guardian fighting for the neighborhood, she was a neighbor in violation herself. And in that collapse, her authority crumbled too. When the vote was called, it wasn't even close. Hands raised against the lawsuit, neighbor after neighbor. Some who'd stayed silent until now lifted their arms high, almost defiantly. The HOA president, his expression resigned, announced, "Motion rejected. No lawsuit will proceed." Carol stood frozen, hands trembling, her neatly organized notes forgotten on the podium. The gap between what she believed she controlled and what reality had revealed seemed to swallow her. And I, quietly holding the survey, felt a complicated relief. I hadn't wanted this to humiliate her, but the truth had to come out. The nuclear option had done its work, not to destroy, but to defend. And for the first time in months, Helen's dream felt safe again. The days that followed the HOA meeting felt oddly quiet, as if the neighborhood itself had exhaled. The flyer-littered mailboxes, whispered phone calls, and tense sidewalk glances were replaced by cautious greetings and small nods of respect. The air felt lighter, still tinged with disbelief, but finally moving past conflict. Word spread quickly that the lawsuit had failed and why. The survey, filed with the county and shared by email among neighbors, spoke louder than rumor ever could. Even those who had been neutral, or quietly skeptical of me, now saw the truth, printed and sealed. And when they learned about the sabotage videos, filmed at night, many shook their heads and muttered, "That's too far." For Carol, the fallout was swift and unmistakable. The same neighbors who once repeated her warnings now crossed the street rather than meet her eyes. The quiet power she had wielded, fear of HOA fines, her authoritative tone, evaporated under daylight. Even the remaining members of the Architectural Review Committee stepped back, privately admitting they'd been misled. 2 months later, a discreet for sale sign appeared at the edge of her pristine lawn, partly hidden by rose bushes that, ironically, strayed across the property line. She never made a public apology. In truth, I never expected one. The woman who had confronted me in pressed blazers and careful speeches had built her certainty on never being wrong, and to admit wrongness would have undone everything she'd told herself. The day the moving truck arrived, neighbors peeked from porches, but few approached. I stood on Helen's bridge, watching quietly as movers boxed patio chairs and garden tools, their boots scuffing the slate stones that, by survey, weren't hers. Carol emerged once to speak to the foreman, face pale and drawn, then retreated back inside. She didn't look my way. When the truck finally rolled off, the street felt strangely peaceful. Not triumphant, more like the closing of a long, bitter chapter. In the weeks that followed, something softer replaced the months of conflict. Mrs. Rodriguez brought over a small pot of climbing roses, gently patted my arm, and said, "Helen would have loved these." Mr. Thompson, leaning on his cane, came to see the nearly finished bridge. "Fine stonework," he murmured, eyes distant, as though remembering someone from his own past. Neighbors who'd stayed silent before now stopped to ask about the design or share memories of Helen's laughter on morning walks. Each conversation felt like a stone placed into the bridge's foundation, binding it not just to Helen's memory, but to the living, breathing neighborhood around it. The bridge itself took shape quietly, fieldstone arching gently across the creek, wide enough for two to walk side by side, just as Helen had imagined. At its center, a small stone plaque read simply, "Helen's Crossing, Forever in Love, 1989 to 2023." On the far side, beneath the old oak tree Helen loved, I placed a weathered wooden bench. Some evenings I sit there, the creek's water moving below, rose petals drifting on the current. And in the hush of twilight, when birds quiet and shadows lengthen, it feels like she's beside me still. Carol's story ended not with her defeat, but with her silence. She moved away. The house sold quickly to a young family whose laughter now echoes where arguments once did. Her roses still bloom, bridging property lines in careless, living color, proof that beauty sometimes outlives the hands that planted it. As for me, I kept building, not just the bridge of stone, but small bridges of kindness, morning nods to neighbors, an open invitation to sit by the creek, to remember that conflict doesn't have to be the final word. In the end, Helen's dream won, not by crushing an enemy, but by outlasting anger, rooted in love and stone and memory. With Carol gone, the street seemed to breathe again. The tension that had once hummed like a low voltage in every HOA email, every sidelong glance at the mailbox, simply disappeared. Neighbors walked slower, conversations felt lighter, and the air around the creek felt truly ours again. The bridge itself, Helen's Crossing, became more than I'd imagined. By design, it wasn't large or ornate, just fieldstone arching gracefully over the creek, wide enough for two people to stand shoulder to shoulder, framed on each side by climbing roses. But it drew people in, as though the story behind it seeped into every stone. Every evening, just before sunset, I found myself there. Sometimes I'd sit alone on the bench under the oak, the creek bubbling quietly below, breeze carrying the sweet scent of rose petals across the water. In those still moments, I'd trace the engraved letters on the plaque, "Forever in Love, 1989 to 2023, and remember Helen's laughter echoing through our kitchen, or her voice late at night as she described the bridge she dreamed of. Other times, I wasn't alone. Mrs. Rodriguez would walk over with a cup of chamomile tea, her little spaniel tugging gently at the leash. She'd sit beside me, telling stories of Helen's kindness, how she'd once brought soup when Mrs. Rodriguez was ill, or shared her favorite children's books for a neighbor's grandson. Mr. Thompson came often too. He'd settle heavily on the bench, cane across his knees, staring thoughtfully at the water. "You know, Art," he said once, voice rough with age, "this bridge feels older than it is, like it belongs here." Then, after a pause, he added quietly, "Kind of like Helen." Families wandered by on weekend afternoons, kids peering over the low stone wall at the creek's minnows darting in silver flashes. A young couple once stopped me to ask about the bridge's story. When I explained, they listened in respectful silence. Before leaving, the woman whispered, "It's beautiful you built this for her." Even the neighbors who'd once sided with Carol seemed changed by the quiet presence of the bridge. They waved across the street, offered gentle words, or paused to admire the roses whose roots stretched confidently into the fresh soil. Where suspicion and rumor had once flourished, something gentler took root: understanding. Helen's Bridge had always been about connection. And in a quiet, unexpected way, it built connections I hadn't known the neighborhood needed. It turned strangers into neighbors, neighbors into something like family. Some evenings, I'd catch my own reflection in the water. Older, yes, worn by grief, but not broken. The creek still moved gently under the bridge, its water untroubled by what had happened above. Watching it reminded me that love, too, can keep flowing, even when the person you love is gone. Occasionally, my mind drifted back to Carol. Not with anger, surprisingly, but with a sober sense of distance. Her house, now lived in by a young family whose laughter reached the creek on breezy afternoons, felt part of the neighborhood again. Her roses still climbed the trellis, blooming defiantly across the survey line, as if reminding me that beauty sometimes outlives even our most stubborn battles. The bridge became what Helen had always hoped, a place of peace, not conflict, of memory, not argument. Its stones settled firmly into the creek bed, unshaken by storms or rumor. And every sunset that bathed the arch in warm gold felt like a quiet promise kept. As the days grew longer, so did the quiet moments I spent there, watching rose petals drift downstream, listening to ducks splash near the bank, and hearing neighbors greet each other warmly on the path. In the end, Helen's Crossing wasn't just a bridge over water, it was a bridge over grief, over division, over anger. It connected what we lost with what we still have, turning love into something you could walk across, hand in hand. And that, more than anything, was the legacy Helen left behind. And so, through grief, patience, and a quiet resolve to honor love, Helen's Crossing finally stood, not just as a bridge over water, but as a bridge over anger, division, and loss. It reminded everyone, neighbors, friends, and even those who once stood against it, that sometimes what we build in memory becomes a gift for the living too. If you faced your own battles with an HOA, neighbors, or built something beautiful out of pain, I'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Your words might inspire someone else who's fighting their own quiet fight. And if you enjoyed this story of resilience, love, and unexpected triumph, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next chapter in our series of real-life neighborhood dramas. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes the strongest bridges are built not from stone and mortar, but from love, patience, and the courage to keep going.